All right, welcome one and all. It is the Iron Age attacks. Welcome to the Maginot Line of the pop culture war. Welcome to the Iron Age offensive, where sequential storytelling and snark collide with sexy results. I am your intrepid host, RazörFist, and today's episode has a very special guest. Before we get to him, you may have noticed that the wait is at last concluded. My gothic western, The Ghost of the Badlands, is riding the range at last. But don't take my word for it, folks. I have something a little special for you. Let's try that again. Right, folks, but enough about the horseback, yes, and buckshot, folks. Enough about the horse skin, enough about the 6-shooters. Let's wrap with the Baron. Today's guest requires little introduction. He's a celebrated story spinner who's worked at every major comic company and Marvel. You know his unparalleled output on Punisher War Journal. Actually, hold on. Sorry, I was reaching for this. This is not you, but it's still Punisher War Journal, so by God, I'm going to show it. He did an X-Wing Rogue Squadron, and even a little literary masterpiece that is Godzilla versus Charles Barkley. But if Barkley was King Charles today, we are in the company of a Baron. Mike Baron, thank you for joining us on the Iron Age attacks.
My pleasure, sir.
I'm grateful to have you here. Gosh, we were both, I guess we should start with the Westerns, because we wanted to do this a long time ago. We wanted to talk about Westerns a bunch and whatnot when you were doing Bronze Star, right?
Right.
So we were both kind of bit by the Western bug at around the same time last year. Myself with Ghost of the Badlands, you with Bronze Star, which is now working on, its second volume?
Well, Pat's drawn away. It's going to be at least a year before it appears, because I have a number of completed projects in the pipeline. But the second one is going to be just as good, if not better, than the first. I'm very excited about it.
Yeah, I always love when I've got the second volume in the can, which, by the way, may or may not be true with Ghost of the Badlands. Kind of sitting there, germinating. But I guess, dude, we got to get into the Westerns here, because I've done several videos on Westerns, my favorite Westerns, the importance of the Western. I think culturally, the Western is massively important to American culture. I think its decline, you can almost track the decline of Western civilization in a lot of ways. So what was your first exposure to the Western?
Oh, man. I recall the themes to every Warner Brothers Western of the 60s. Wagon Train, Lawman, Wanted, Dead or Alive.
Ooh.
Yeah,
Have gun will travel. Tell me have gun will travel.
Will travel reads the card of a man. Well, I don't want to sing them all.
Are you a knight without armor in a savage land, Mike Barron?
That's right.
Is that what you're telling me?
Not me, although I admire that knight without armor.
Who doesn't, for crying out loud? All right, let's bring up the chat here so the fans can go ahead and participate. You are beloved in the chat, Mr. Barron. But yeah, what do you reckon is the best of? Okay, best TV Western, best Western movie. We got to start there.
When it comes to TV Westerns, I have to go with Have Gun Will Travel because I'm a loner type guy. I'm a loner type guy, and I'm a vigilante type guy. And the vigilante was essential to the settling of the West.
Yes.
I'm reading a book right now called Tombstone, which is the true story of the Battle of OK Corral. It's about the Earp brothers, and it's shocking how casual they were with shooting each other back in the day.
Oh yeah. Not only that, but like a lot of people don't realize the true backstory of the gunfight, that the Earp brothers might have been involved in a coach robbery, and there was some blackmail involved, and Ike Clanton was worried that Wyatt Earp was going to tell that he had sold out the Cowboys, and like there was a whole thing there that is in none of the movies. Here's my favorite detail. I don't know if they talk about this in the book. My favorite detail about the Battle of the OK Corral. It was snowing that day.
I haven't got to that part yet.
It was snowing. Nobody has made the movie where it's snowing during the gunfight at the OK Corral. But that is true. If you go up to Tombstone, it's up in the high country, right? And it snows out there. It's still Arizona, but it snows. Believe it or not, we do occasionally have a climate here, folks. But you and I we were talking beforehand how we kind of come at it from different angles. Oh, before we move on, though, what about movies? What would be the best movie?
Well, everybody's got their own list, but for me, my favorite Western is The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance. Because I favor Westerns that are about the closing of the West and the taming of the vigilantes and how civilization spread its fingers slowly toward the Pacific. And that's what that movie is about.
Yeah, and there's several of those. Once Upon a Time in the West, Sergio Leone, kind of like that a little bit.
Oh,
right?
Yeah.
With the prostitute at the end deciding to go out and basically help build a community instead of being a
and every one of Peckinpah's films, most particularly The Wild Bunch.
Oh, absolutely. And of course, in a more contemporary context, we got a younger audience, right? Red Dead. The Red Dead video games very much are inspired by those themes. And so the Red Dead video games are all about every single game, closing the West. I think the first Red Dead Redemption was 1900-something. It was like World War I was about to start, right? People don't realize how long the Old West lasted in parts of this country. They don't realize it was well into the 20s, even 30s, arguably in some places, certain regions of the country. Because, I mean, gosh, Arizona wasn't even a state until the early part of the 20th century. That's pretty crazy to think about. But
are you in Arizona?
I am. I'm in Phoenix.
Oh.
Yeah, Ghost of the Badlands takes place in Canyon Diablo, Arizona. And not only have I been out there, but George, the artist, he's obsessive about detail, right? Like that. So he wanted to actually go there, feel the soil, see it. And so he came down from New Jersey, where he's based out of, and actually did that before he drew that. And I think you definitely can see the quality in the work. So what attracts you? We're talking about vigilantism. What morally attracts you to the Western? I obviously have fairly definite feelings in this connection, but there are like disparate feelings on this point in modern Westerns. Like neo-Westerns are very gray. So what?
Well, I think the vigilante is an American archetype and looms large not only in history, but in the popular imagination, because the vigilante was essential to the taming of the West. And the reason is the Earp brothers were out there long before there was a government, long before they established a senator or a sheriff's office, although Wyatt Earp was sheriff for a while. But other communities, they had no law enforcement, so to speak, except that the law enforcement that they created for themselves, which sometimes led to lynch mobs. And that's where civilization comes in and limits that sort of thing. But without the vigilante, there would be no settling of the West. And not only was Wyatt Earp a vigilante, so was Kit Carson and Buffalo Bill and Wild Bill Hickok. They were all vigilantes to an extent. They all had to step up at some point and face down the bad guys lest chaos rule.
Yeah, that definitely is a recurrent theme, and you have to remember, like, one of my favorite books is a book called The Not So Wild Wild West, right? It's actually about, like, the economics of the frontier and the administration of the frontier. And it makes this argument for, like, how property rights worked on the frontier. Like, how do you do that? You don't have a federal government that tells you own a thing and is going to protect you. The federal government's far, far away. How do you protect your own? How do you handle that? Vigilantism is an outgrowth of that, obviously. And it's interesting how from the earliest vigilantes, I'm a huge fan of the Shadow, right? Huge fan of the Shadow. When you look at the Shadow, people think that he's wearing a fedora. They think that he's wearing a cape because they see it through a superhero lens. No, the Shadow helped create superheroes. He's dressed like a cowboy. He's got an Inverness cape. He's got a slouch hat, right? He's got the two guns. He was fashioned as a cowboy. This is a vigilante. And superheroes flow from, there is not one superhero in the modern day that would exist if the Shadow and Doc Savage didn't exist. Like, there's
they were the archetypes for sure.
Yeah, without question. Like, I speaking of which, that leads us to one of your more recent projects. I recently had your co-creator, Blaine Lee Pardo, on the inaugural episode of Iron Age Attacks, and he mentioned working with you on an upcoming work of vigilante fiction. To which I say, Mike, you had me at vigilante.
It's funny because that book takes place in the here and now, right now, but it takes place in the Wild West, Portland. There is no law. There is no law in Portland now. They succeeded in discouraging the police from doing their job and driving most of them out. And now these hoodlums can do whatever they want as long as it's coached in the language of social justice.
Oh, absolutely. Oh, my gosh. It's some of the horror stories out of there with people being attacked. Or even the protests. I mean, when you can have protesters who literally occupy federal buildings.
I know.
And nothing happens. Absolutely nothing happens. And any official that speaks out against it either has to step down or they just have to mosey along. Dude, that's the thing that amazes me about the failure of the modern comic companies is you have the setup to a superhero film in real life. Like, you don't even have to. The early, it's not a coincidence the Shadow comes around during Prohibition when there's gangsters mowing people down in the streets with Tommy guns. Like, you had the setup for that story, and indeed they ripped a lot of those stories from the headlines. So what's like the framing of this? It's called Tenure, by the way, right?
Yeah, it's about a history professor who refuses to use a student's preferred pronoun. So the first thing that happens is the university kicks him out. The second thing that happens is that Antifa targets him. First, they drive his wife off the road and she dies in a car crash. Then they call in a SWAT hit on his house, and FBI agents, poorly trained agents, shoot his daughter to death.
You could have just stopped at FBI agents. It's fine.
And so Braxton's a man who has nothing to lose,
right?
But he is ex-military, and he's not one of these deadly snipers or hand-to-hand combat guys. But he does understand technique, tactics, and strategies. And he says, "All right, enough. It's going to end with me." Yeah. So he starts going after everyone who participated in the mob against him.
Nice. Kind of reminds me of. You remember that movie from the 60s? One of the early canon films. Joe? Yeah, Joe.
I love Joe. Yeah.
It's a freaking great
Except
movie.
that was tongue-in-cheek. It ridiculed Peter Boyle's character.
Right. But it's genius, and he becomes the protagonist, and it doesn't even matter. No one cares.
Another movie of the 60s, or the 70s, excuse me, is Death Wish.
Oh, yes. I was just gonna ask you. So we have to put this, because I did Death Wish month, I did Dirty Harry month, I did, all that stuff, reviewed all the movies in order. Okay. All right. It's the lightning round. Are you ready?
Yeah.
Death Wish or Dirty Harry? Heaven or hell, duel one, let's rock. Which is it?
Dirty Harry's a better movie. I love them both, but Dirty Harry's just a better movie because Don Siegel's a better director than the guy that did Death Wish.
Michael Winner? Heresy! Yeah. Heresy, I tell you!
I created a character called Private American because Marvel was determined to drag the Punisher through the mud because they're embarrassed by the Punisher now. They don't understand history. They don't understand the role of the vigilante. So I created Private American, and when we first meet him, he's on the southern border. And when people found out about that, the left attacked. There's a far left hate site called the Daily Coast, and it ran a story headline, Punisher creator Mike Baron releases another racist AF comic book. Now, there's a couple of lies in that headline. The first one is, I didn't create the Punisher. The second one is, there's nothing racist about the book at all. The person who wrote it has never seen the book. In fact, she's never read anything I've written. So we hired a lawyer and we went after him. And of course, they say, well, come and get us. George Soros is going to pay for our defense. That's all right. But when people found out about that, they don't like it. No. They don't like these leftist bullies. So the book did very well. It's available on my site, baroncomics.com. We're working on a second issue.
Yeah, but that's not the biggest thing. Oh, my goodness. Real quick. That's not your most recent foray into sort of this Iron Age of creativity that we're in. I'm well acquainted with this series as a former comic shop stooge. Ladies, gentlemen, please pause and allow me to present the long-awaited return of the sci-fi space opera extraordinaire by the name of Nexus.
An ancient evil, billions of years old, wages war on the universe. Entire star systems are vanishing without a trace, leaving devastation in their wake. Nexus, the intergalactic guardian of lost souls, must stop the unnameable terror and its expanding scourge of destruction. The totality of everything in existence will collapse upon itself if he fails. With the fate of the cosmos in the balance, Nexus must confront his most dangerous adversary yet. Can he save creation from total and certain destruction, or will darkness reign supreme? Find out in Nexus Scourge, the all-new epic sci-fi adventure from Eisner-winning co-creator Mike Baron, exploding with Kelsey Shannon's dynamic artwork. Available now at baroncomics.com.
All right. Yeah, I've known about this comic for the longest time. I've always loved it, loved the art. I've dug Nexus for years. I guess start at the very, very beginning. How did Nexus originally come to be? It was like early 80s, right?
Well, I had just met Steve Rude, a guy who ran a newspaper, said there's some guy down here trying to sell us his drawings, and he draws just like you. Now, this guy was no artist, but so I met the dude, and he showed me his portfolio, and I was blown away. And I said, well, what do you want to do? He said, well, I want to do comics, but I can't write. What do you want to do? And we just happened to be at the right place at the right time. Capital City Distribution, the second largest comic book distributor in the world at that time, decided they wanted to launch their own title. So we showed them one thing we did, the first thing we did, which was mildly amusing. And the publisher, Milt, said, nah, we want a costume superhero. So I went home and I brainstormed. And I thought, what would make him compelling? If somebody died every time he showed up. But I wanted to make him sympathetic too. So Nexus is a reluctant executioner of mass murderers. At night he dreams of them, these horrible, realistic dreams about mass murderers committing their atrocities. And he wakes up in a sweat. And he understands that if he doesn't eliminate them, the dreams will recur until they drive him mad. And he's being manipulated by an insane alien, which is where he gets his power. And when he wakes up the first time from these dreams, the costume is waiting. It's very zen. So he puts it on. He does what he has to do. And I wrote the first 12 pages like I used to write comics for 20 years, which is I drew it out entirely by hand. Then I gave it to the dude. He penciled it, inked it, lettered it. We showed it to the boys. And they said, yeah, now we need 20 more pages. So we were off and running.
Yeah, and that was
An
boy, that
ancient
was
evil,
oops. Sorry, I'm
billions
playing it
of
again.
years
My
old.
goodness. Not that I don't love the trailer. It's an amazing trailer. you should go check it out.
It is, yeah.
We have it down in the description where you can go check it out. It's been very, very successful, but Nexus has been around for a long, long time. I've read a lot of Nexus over the years. Dude, it's interesting. You mentioned there, you've had an on again, off again, on again, off again, on again, off again relationship with a fellow Phoenician by the name of Steve Rude. I used to work at a comic store out here that he would sometimes occasion to enter.
Well, he lives in Phoenix now.
Yeah. And it was universally agreed by the staff there that he was a different breed of cat. How did the two of you hook up? What went down between you two? Like originally, it was just because he could not write and he needed somebody really to make that happen.
Well, yeah, but I always had a flair for comic writing. I always knew I did, and it was there from the beginning. Dude and I remain fast friends. In fact, we speak frequently. We talked last week. We'll probably talk again next week.
Yeah.
And he's pursuing his own version, because at some point about 15 years ago, he decided he wanted to write his own adventures. So I said, well, that's fine, man.
Yeah.
You do your thing and I'll do mine. And I've just been so busy with other projects that it took me a long time to get back to Nexus. But what I did, it's a thermonuclear bomb. I think it's one of the best stories I've ever written. It's going to blow your mind. And Kelsey Shannon's art, which you've seen a glimpse of, is blow your mind too.
Stunning. Just check out that trailer. All the images from it have been fantastic, but Nexus has always had great art. It's always been one of those books that just, people like John Cassidy and such should be sending royalties, honestly. You know what I mean? Like a whole generation of artists, really. But it was advantageous, dude. Right at that time there was kind of an indie comics boom that was about to happen there.
Yeah.
At that time, Rocketeer and then Turtles and like just one thing after another. What did you dig about like that? Like try and describe that time for me, because I wasn't even alive, and it seems really, really cool to just be able to go into a comic store and you've got your Spider-Man, you've got your Superman, you've got your Batman. Heck, even comic shops weren't even well established at that point as a phenomenon. But now all of a sudden, here's this new invention, Ninja Turtles. Here's this new invention, Nexus. We don't get that anymore.
It was a golden age. And the problem I don't want to go into the problem of the comics today, right now, although I'll be happy to go into that later. But, Chairman Mao had a saying for the new Chinese nation. He said, let 100 flowers blossom. And that's what happened. It was the great day of the independent comic, although there are more independent comics today now, more than ever. It's just that First, which inherited Nexus after Capital decided they didn't know what they were doing, they sold the right to First. And by the way, Steve Rude and I own Nexus. And the only reason we own Nexus is because Mike Richardson, the publisher of Dark Horse, bought the rights and returned them to us in an act of generosity that has never been repeated, as far as I know. But there was a lot of great titles. There was Grimjack. Mike Grell was doing John Sable. Paul Chadwick was doing Concrete. It was true a golden age, and a lot of those books were cooking. I remember Cerebus the Aardvark in fact, Cerebus is still around to a certain degree, not in the superhero category, but was a well-written comic, a comic you could enjoy, a comic that draws you in.
Yeah.
Now, whenever I do a comic, it's my goal to grab the reader by the throat on the first page and draw him into the narrative to the exclusion of all else, so that if something interrupts him, like a fire alarm, he's going to say, shut it off. I don't want to hear it. I got to find out what happens next.
Yep.
What happens next is the essential question in all fiction. If the reader doesn't care, he's not going to turn the page.
Yeah. How do you of course, I've never really considered myself an author, but I guess I've written and published stuff now. So my whole idea of how to write is completely different and still pretty nascent. You are a vet among vets. What is the first thing you do? Because, dude, I get so many questions in this sort of new eruption of creativity, of independent creativity. Hey, what's some advice for writing? What is like word one that you do? What is the first thing that you do when you know that there's a story coming?
Number one, you carry a notepad and a pen with you at all times. And then when you get an idea, you write it down. You write down anything that could pertain to the story, including names, snatches of dialogue, anything. And you keep gathering them until at some point you reach what I call a critical mass. And at that point, the story emerges, the outline. You can see it. You can see the protagonist. You can see his struggle. And once you have that, I do an outline now. I didn't used to outline. I used to just sit down and wing it. And that's how I wrote comics for 20 years. But as I said, my method of writing by drawing each page out by hand was an essential learning tool. And if you want to do a comic, I would recommend that for everyone. But now I'm a firm believer in the outline. Yeah. And what I strive to do is to make every word and every picture count. I don't want any wasted space in my comic. I don't want the reader to think he's treading water, waiting for something to happen. And that doesn't mean there's got to be a fight or an explosion on every page. You can have quiet moments that are absolutely gripping. It depends on how you handle them. And one of the most important things is to use fresh language, to phrase things in a way that are interesting in and of themselves. And to do that, you can draw on your own history. I eavesdrop shamelessly. And when I hear somebody use a phrase that I've never heard before, I write it down. And one of my innovations is I noticed that when people were saying, I'm going to, as in I'm going to go buy some liquor, it came out like this. I'm going to go buy some liquor. Omina. So I started using that in my fiction, O-M-I-N-A. And people noticed and they liked it. And that's one of the things I try to do is to write in dialogue the way people really talk. But I don't do that in the non-dialogue.
Interesting. Is there like a writer that you kind of picked up a lot of that from, or is this mostly just experiential? I mean, you certainly have no lack of it.
That's experiential, but I've been greatly influenced by many writers. But the main one is John D. MacDonald. The reason I'm writing today is because I got hooked on his Travis McGee novels as a kid. John D. MacDonald was one of the greatest pulp writers in American history. Many people have not heard of them, yet everybody has seen the movie Cape Fear, one version or another, and that's one of his novels. But Travis McGee, he wrote in the first person, and the thing about Travis is he's one of these loners who down these mean streets a tarnished knight must go.
Right.
He's kind of a court of last resort. He's a vigilante in a way. So I created my biker series is based on Travis McGee. I just turned in the 10th one, and their hard-boiled crime about a reformed motorcycle hoodlum who goes to prison. He finds God in prison, and he comes out determined to turn his life around. Those stories are brutal, and I'm still ripping stories from the headlines. I try not to be blatant about it. My number one rule, is it's my job to entertain, and I never lose sight of that fact.
Right.
There are no lectures. There are no bumper stickers. Number two is show, don't tell. And that goes hand in hand with number one. If you want to entertain people, if you want to show them that John was a bad man, you don't say John was a bad man. You say John crossed the street to kick the dog.
Yeah. You describe him being, yeah, absolutely. The anti-Hideo Kojima method, if you will. How do you feel about endings? I love the Mickey Spillane quote of nobody reads a book to get to the middle. I love that. I love that so
for
much.
me, the perfect ending comes as a complete surprise and in retrospect, inevitable. And that's what I strive to do with all my longer works. And the perfect example of that is the ending to Planet of the Apes.
Oh.
When Charlton Heston and his girlfriend are going up the shore and they see the Statue of Liberty half buried in the sand, he says, "It's Earth." Of course it's Earth.
Right.
We all should have known it was Earth.
Right, exactly. It's like when you go and watch a Zack Snyder film and it always ends with you walking out. No, absolutely. So you've done a lot of, most people probably would identify you with Punisher for whatever reason.
Yeah.
What about your time on Punisher resonated on some level? Like, what about it has made that run endure? Because I used to have a roommate, biggest Punisher collector on the planet, and he would rave about your stuff. Dude, Punisher fans love your run. So what
It was
was it
very
about?
simple. I approached it as a straight crime story. And for the first 3 years, there were no flying saucers or time travel or Punisher kills the Archie universe. Punisher was going after drug runners, gun runners, crooked bankers, charismatic preachers. He was going after real people, real villains you could relate to. Now, Kingpin and Doc Doom did appear, but they seem to be natural antagonists for the Punisher. I mean, that made for a seamless story, especially Kingpin.
Yeah, I mean, Kingpin's a crime boss. Ever since Frank Miller got a hold of him, Kingpin has been a straight-up crime boss. He was always kind of a robber baron type. But yeah, I don't know. What exactly about that character though? Like, did he resonate with you on some level? Is that what I've always kind of been of that opinion? There's got to be something about the character that just kind of hits with you to really work.
Yeah, I mean, he's the archetypal American vigilante. He is the vigilante, the court of last resort. But I made him a very moral man. He was a devout Catholic. And there's an issue called Holy Terror where he goes to confession. And I think that's a crucial part of his personality. You have to understand that. Of course, that infuriated Marvel, and they trashed all that in their many iterations. And then they dragged him through the mud, and then they made him a ninja, and they did away with the skull. And they said, oh, we're embarrassed when the military or the police use the skull. I was never embarrassed. I understood why they were using the skull. It stood for justice.
Right. Not only that, but it's a tough guy symbol. It's a tough guy comic. It's so silly. You just leave it to Marvel and they'll find a way to rob themselves of money. What even is that logo supposed to be? The new one? I don't even know. And didn't it just get canceled?
Yeah, it looks like an octopus or a walrus or something.
You know what it kind of looks like? It looks like the Boba Fett symbol a little bit from Star Wars, which is apropos given the state of that franchise as well. Right. What, like, culturally in comics, I got to catch a little glimpse of this just because the comic store that I worked in was kind of important. It was the big national chain. It was whatever. The owner was on a first name basis with, you know, the heads of Marvel and DC and all that stuff. And I sat down to dinner with like Joe Quesada and stuff because of this at a con and whatnot. So I got to see a little bit of the advanced. This was right before Cebulski. They were really high on Cebulski. And it just seemed like there were some warning signs in the industry in general. But boy, like I had no idea it would be at this point in terms of just the absolute state of the industry. What was like the earliest that you noticed? Like what the wheels are coming off here. Like what's going on?
Well, you know, I was out to the big two before the wheels came off, and there are many reasons why comics are circling the drain. And the big one that nobody ever mentions is that we have a whole generation of kids here that were raised on video games who don't read comics, and who can blame them? Because the average video game like Call of Duty or Grand Theft Auto is simply more entertaining than a $5 comic book from a corporate company. Yeah. And another reason for that is when I was coming up, my editors were writers too, guys like Archie Goodwin and Denny O'Neil. They knew how to entertain. And I don't know these modern editors, but I look at their product, and it seems to me that entertainment isn't even on the chart, that's the last thing they're thinking about. Everybody's got an agenda they want to push. Everybody's got a chip on their shoulder. And that's why the comics are filled with lectures.
It's so strange, too, because you look at other comic industries, manga in Japan, bande dessinée in Europe, and they're considered art forms in those countries. They actually have some claim to being art. They've had exhibitions in the Louvre and whatnot. And yet, they're trouncing American comics who are convinced they're going to save the world, right? What is going on? And they're by far less preachy, which is crazy because politically, they're even further left in Europe than we are. And yet somehow the artists, the writers of those books can hold themselves politically in harness for the sake of actually entertaining people. What is the cultural peculiarity there exactly? Is there anything like in the culture at Marvel and DC that is informing this, or do you have any idea?
No, I don't. And what's remarkable is that they get beaten over the head over and over and over, and they learn nothing. look at Disney, with their grooming of children. And I mean, that's been going on for years, and it's outrageous. And DeSantis was taking back their special perks for the land they owned and their tax breaks because he didn't like it, and most people don't like it. And the attendance at the theme park is way down. The stocks are way down, and yet they kept on putting out this woke work that nobody wants because it's not entertaining. And only now, all of a sudden, they're having a come to Jesus moment and say, well, maybe we should put out something people want to see.
Yeah. I still remember when Ann Nocent, because you've done Punisher, I'm a huge Daredevil mark, right? And I remember when Ann Nocenti did that book and caught flack for that being too political at the time. You go back and read those comics, and they come off completely disciplined in their worldview. They don't come off preachy in the slightest, and it's almost quaint to look back at how some people were like, oh gosh, she's getting all political now, Anne. What's going on here? It's so far afield from where it was. Now you've got open advocation of communism. You've got my favorite was possibly the high watermark was when they hired the Muslim artist on X-Men. And he inserted the Quran. The Quran versus in there.
Which they keep shoving her down our throat, and nobody wants her.
Oh no! I'm talking about in X-Men. They got an artist.
Oh yeah, I know. Yeah, and they have an editor there. What is her name? Well, I don't know a thing about her. I'm not going to talk about her. But
fair enough. Fair enough.
Sana Amanat.
Oh, right.
Co-creating Kamala Khan, first Muslim American superhero.
Yes.
Yeah.
No. My favorite was, I don't know if you heard about this. It was the in one of the X-Men comics, there was a Muslim artist, and there was something going on, and he started inserting Quran verses and weird Muslim propaganda into the panels. Colossus was wearing a weird verse, and it was apparently politically charged. And my favorite one, this is just so beyond the pale. I would not know. So you know Shadowcat, right? She's Jewish. The character is Jewish.
I've heard of her.
There's a panel, and she's standing there, and there's this like skyline, right? And you've got like shop windows, and there's a shop window for jewelry. Right? That's the name of it. And they cut off the word jewelry after the W with her head. I'm just like, and so he got fired. It was a whole thing. It was freaking.
It was Joe Bennett.
Oh my God. It was
a terrific artist.
Oh my God.
Yeah, I didn't see that. But as Bosch Foston points out, the only reason we are featuring Muslims in every form of entertainment and having them shoved down our throat is because they're ready to kill us at the drop of a hat.
Right. Fair enough. I don't know. Did you, what are were all just your influences in general in creating comics? Did you immediately think, oh, I really like Spider-Man, the generic kind of origin story. I really like Spider-Man. Or was it, no, I love these pulps. I love these yellow paperbacks. What was it that drew you in general to begin with?
Uncle Scrooge.
Dude, people do not sleep on Uncle Scrooge. That comic, still to this day, people will pick up every single issue. It's crazy.
Carl Barks is probably the greatest genius to ever work in comics. If you read his stories, the Donald Duck and Uncle Scrooge stories, there's not a wasted picture. There's not a wasted word. The characterizations are brilliant. The plots are brilliant. That was a master, and I learned a lot from him. I mean, if you want to study how a master uses the medium, look at the Uncle Scrooge comics by Carl Barks.
Yeah, even to this day, I still remember working in the comic store. This was around 06, 07, somewhere in there. And there were customers who would walk in, beeline for the Donald Duck and Scrooge comics, and walk out, and they weren't interested in anything else. And it's a larger number of people than you would think. Really, which is amazing because who's that owned by? Disney. What are they doing with it? They're cranking out. I don't know what they're
doing with him now.
Yeah, no kidding. But I mentioned European comics earlier. There's incredible Disney comics that are being published in France and in Italy and
Oh,
whatnot.
I'm aware of those. Yeah.
Just
But it wasn't until college when a student showed me a comic drawn by Neil Adams.
Yeah.
And I thought, holy shit, this is what comics are doing now. And that got me back in because I fell in love with Neil's art. And, we all buy comics for the art and we don't pay that much attention to the story because we're attracted to the aesthetic of the individual artists like Jim Starlin and Bernie Wrightson and Barry Windsor Smith. You see that art and you say, I got to have this. And what the hell? It was like 35 cents or $1 at the time. So you got it.
Yeah.
And for the most part, those Conan stories were adapted from Robert E. Howard. So they're pretty good by Roy Thomas.
Oh, Roy Thomas. We just had on Russ Leach, who's doing a new Cull adaptation on the last episode. And we were just talking back and forth about Roy Thomas, man. He did a great job not only on Conan, all that pulp stuff, Solomon Kane, Elric. He had such respect and reverence for those. You can almost replace the original books with those comics. And they're just panel for panel, word for word, beautiful adaptations of those stories.
I did an Elric adaptation for First, too.
Which one? I knew
I got the books here, Razor.
I was going to ask,
to...
but I didn't go back and research. So which one?
Oh, I'll have to go look because I have the books, but I'll be happy to send you a copy.
I've got them all. Don't worry about it.
All right. I'll go look and I'll tell you. I'll go look. It was Elric. Oh, man. I don't know. But, I'll have to go look.
Yeah, most of it was Roy Thomas, except at the tail end, P. Craig Russell wrote and drew. At the
he's a great artist. Great artist.
Mind-blowing stuff. Just nobody quite like him. Yeah. Really crazy. Speaking of which, so Neil Adams got you into it.
And then somebody showed me a page by Steranko.
Oof.
And I thought, wow.
Still a legend.
That's what comics should be. And I've been lucky to get to know Jim a little bit over the years, and he's a great guy. He's still creating.
And a madman in the best possible way. Like, you hear about his daily routine, and like he sleeps for 4 hours a day and runs up a mountain, and
that's right.
Grows his own food like this nut job. I love him so much. And based. Shock. If you're not following Steranko on Twitter, folks, you're wasting your lives. Like, you're not even. What was it? I'm just curious. Was it Nick Fury, or what was it?
Yeah, it was Nick Fury.
God. And the thing that I love about him is he's a champion, it's kind of like it sounds like you are, of the pulp origins of comics. He did that Steranko history of comics. Yeah. He was the guy to finally set the record straight on Batman in the Shadow. Years and years ago. Hey, Batman's a total ripoff. Like, you could go look over here. And Steranko's drawn some good Batman, folks. I think he's got license to say it. But yeah.
And Jim also took characters from the Maltese Falcon and put them into Nick Fury, like the Fat Man. Who's that play? Sidney
Greenstreet.
Yeah, Sidney Greenstreet. He put Sidney Greenstreet in his comics.
Oh, I love that. Did you ever get into like you're coming in right in the early 80s. That's right when, the sort of Euro comics invasion, the heavy metal, and then Marvel did Epic. And did you ever pick up any of that stuff and dig it?
Oh, yeah. I had some stories in Epic, and I had 2 titles on the Epic label that Carl Potts instituted. One was, it was with Mark Nelson, and the other was with Bill Reinhold, one of my favorite artists. I'd love to work with Bill again. What was that, Mark Nelson? I'm drawing a blank. I have them over here on a shelf. I could go get them and look them up, but they're old
the
now.
ubiquitous shelves of the comic creator.
Yeah.
What do you think about, speaking of Epic, I've always thought, like, because as I understand it, kind of Stan Lee, as he was on his way out, was like, hey, he caught a glimpse of what was happening in Europe, what is happening in Japan, and he was kind of prevailing on the company. Hey, guys, you need to go to something a little higher quality, blah, blah, blah. He had no influence at this point. He was just on his way out. It was just his advice. Nobody really listened to him, but they did throw that Epic thing out there, and they tried to do Epic Illustrated to try and compete. What happened with all that? What do you think they wound up dropping it? What did you think they dropped the ball? What happened? Because looking back, Marvel had an opportunity to future-proof themselves a little bit from what's happening right now. Focus more on graphic novels, move away from the issue-by-issue format. What happened there from your perspective as someone who was actually under the imprint?
Well, I don't know, because most of those epic titles were exceptional.
Actually, they were. They
should be going today, but it was all Carl Pott's idea. It was his idea to do the epic title, I believe.
Yeah.
But you know, the publishers go and a new publisher comes in, and it's any branch of showbiz. Whenever a new CEO comes in, they want to leave their imprint. They want to remake everything in their own ideas. Yeah. And so when that happens, everything the previous CEO did, like taking out an option on these properties, say, oh, that's gone. We're not going to do that. I got my own properties I want to bring in. Unless it's a franchise that's so beloved and respected that you can run it into the ground decades after it appeared, like Star Wars.
Right. Or hey, can we have another movie with the Joker in it, you think? You think that character's been ridden hard enough, for crying out loud? You did a little...
Gaga. Yeah.
You did a little...
She's going to be Harley Quinn, probably. No.
Oh, God. You know what? You're probably near the mark on that. For crying out loud. You did a little bit of Batman. What did you... I mean, not that much, but like what... How did you like working on the character? Did you?
Oh, I get into any character that I get to write. I had a good time with it, especially the 2-issue series I did with Bill Reinhold.
Yeah, that was...
which was about a crazy architect, which has always fascinated me. But when I think about Batman, I think, well, there have only been 1 million Batman stories, so it's hard to distinguish yourself. But every now and then, somebody comes along, like Frank Miller, who offers a new take on it that's vital and compelling.
Yeah, absolutely.
But that hasn't happened in a while.
No, it really hasn't. There hasn't been a... Do you think that's down to... Some people speculate it's comic creators got so big in the 90s that it was like, nobody's going to be as big as the business ever again. We're not going to let that happen. Is that...
Well, no, it's the quality of the editors and the creators that they're bringing in.
Yeah.
As I mentioned before, rule number 1 is to entertain. You have to entertain, or the reader's going to yawn and put the book aside. And I think they've lost sight of that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I don't know. I could talk to you all night about all this stuff, but we need to sell some soap because this Nexus comic is amazing.
Sell the soap.
Yes. Soap with the prize inside. Speaking of Westerns. It is. But no, guys, go check out Nexus, the new book, Nexus Scourge. And we have a link down below in the description. Also, of course, for what it's worth, goes to the Badlands. The monochrome edition is out in about 1 month from now. The color edition will launch as well through Arcaven Comics. And of course, if you supported the Indiegogo, those are shipping out as we speak, ladies and gentlemen. You've got way more projects than that, though. I feel like I'm missing something. Sell me more.
Oh yeah. Well, Kelsey Shannon has signed up for 2 more Nexus projects. And the next one we're going to do is the Origin Remastered. And that'll be the first 3 black and white issues. And that comes out to about 105 pages that Kelsey is coloring. And anybody who has seen Kelsey's colors knows that this is going to be a home run. We're very excited about that. And finally, he's working on a 3rd graphic novel called Triplets. And the first 22 pages are done. It's going to be 66 pages when it's finished. And it's about 3 triplets who are born who have perfect telepathic mind meld between them. And in the future, the only way to communicate instantly between star systems is via telepathy. Everything else takes too long, which makes these 3 kids extremely valuable to currency speculators and criminal organizations. So they're kidnapped and spread out across the galaxy, and it's up to Nexus to rescue them.
Right on. I love it. Oh, we've also got, guys, I'm so into talking to you right now. I'm like ignoring super chats over here. What is going on? Mario Trujillo. You don't mind answering a few of these, do you?
No.
He says, a fun fact about the closing of the West. A lot of cowboys were cattle raiders who robbed Mexican ranchers. That all ended when Mexico set up military bases across the border in the 1870s. That's always an interesting aspect of the Old West, is the byplay between Mexico and America and all of that stuff. And of course you have sort of the frontiersmen who were caught in between, and the U.S. government trying to get people to settle through the Homestead Act and such. And in a lot of ways, these people kind of were thrown to the wolves, sort of.
I gotta throw out one correction, Razor, and that's that my current website is baroncomics.com.
Baron
Comics, and you can get all my books there. And if you go up to the top and you just click Mike's books, you'll see Florida Man, Thin Blue Line, Private American, Bronze Star, and of course the Nexus.
In fact, I'll go ahead and right now, there we go. I'll just baroncomics.com. Look at that. Presto changeo. It's right there on the screen. This is where you can pick that up. I believe it takes you right to a page for Nexus as well, for Nexus Scourge. So highly, highly recommend you check that out, guys. If you liked what you saw in that trailer, and I certainly did. Speaking of, the Happy Plague Doctor says, speaking of property rights, it would have been impossible with millions of bisons steamrolling everything under the sun. Mercenary X, what killed Wild West stories? He has a question. I'll just put this to you. What killed Wild West stories? He says, I heard things.
You know, what killed it is simply the lack of the studios to do more Westerns. There's still Westerns being done. Yellowstone is a brilliant Western. It's contemporary, but now that actor...
Costner.
Help me out here. Kevin Costner is bailing to do another epic Western series. And I think he's a guy who's gotten a lot better as he's got older. I loved Yellowstone. When I look at his early movies like Silverado, I don't buy him. He seems callow and unsuited to the part. And the same for his Wyatt Earp. But now he's growing into that role, and he can do it. And there have been some good Westerns recently, like Old Henry.
Oh, I've heard good things about that one. Yeah, Old Henry. One just before that inspired The Ghost of the Badlands is an Austrian Western, actually, called The Dark Valley, that I highly recommend. Classic retribution, stranger rolls into town, only instead of the Old West, it's in a mountain valley in Austria.
Oh,
brilliant.
That's good.
Absolutely brilliant. So I dug that. It's got a great style to it, too.
And the Australian film industry, they do Westerns as well.
They do. And this is a sad part about Australian gun control, from my perspective, is guns built that country. Guns, the Old West frontier period in Australia is very real, and it's a part of their national identity as much as Anzacs and anything else that they traditionally associate with. And yet it has been suppressed to such a degree as they civilize, right? They're losing an essential part of the Australian character. I mean, look, I'm not from Australia, but...
And they're making a big mistake there because they're forgetting Western freedom and liberty. And, and I don't know what's happening in Australia, but it's not good.
Yeah, absolutely. Scorpio04 just says, awesome interview. Thank you, sir. Thank you for joining us. Well-Read Comics says, incredible interview. 2 stellar creators. Nexus rocks, he finishes with. And he's absolutely correct. I could have told you that if I had never spoken to this gentleman at all. Always great stories. You know what? I didn't explore that enough. I meant to ask this question. It is a mix of superhero, space opera, whatever. What space operas inspired it, and what superhero stories inspired it, if any, on either side?
Well, I do have to say that came out of my own head. And I've enjoyed many great writers. I will say one who influenced me was Philip Jose Farmer.
Oh.
He influenced me when I wrote The Bowl-Shaped World, because Farmer's forte was creating these fantastic worlds as if he were a god, and he had gods create these worlds. There's this whole World of Tears series he did, and also River World. So he was a big, one of the few influences on my science fiction that I can identify.
Really? So I love that time period in sci-fi, in fantasy, in where it's still, there's an edge of, you would file sci-fi under adventure. And you would because back then genre was way looser. Today, everything's all categorical. One of the things that bugs me, I don't know if it bugs you as much, but whenever I hear someone say, I got a story I want to tell, it's like, okay, cool. What is it? Well, it's kind of like a steampunk western mixed with a cyberpunk with a sword and like, oh, don't just slap a story together from genres. Have a story to tell. What are you doing? That drives me. Does that drive you nuts too?
Yeah, it does. In fact, I wrote an essay called What's Your Story About? And it's on my Substack column. And I think everybody who wants to pitch a story should read it. Because there's a proper way to do it, and I lay it out and the essay's very entertaining as well, and it's filled with examples.
I love that kind of stuff, folks. Sit at the feet of this learning tree if you while you can, because this is important knowledge to absorb, ladies and gentlemen. But yeah, before we sign off, anything else you want to plug and fire at our head holes, because this has been a blast.
Well, I have a new book coming out on the Rippaverse in about a month.
That's right. You do. All right.
With art by Will Conrad. It's going to blow your mind. And people who are complaining that their Rippaverse stories aren't fulfilling, they're getting there. All I can say is hang on to your hat, take a look at this book. And you should read ISOM and ISOM number 2. Because one thing that Eric did there is he avoided every cliche. Those books are cliche-free.
Very interesting. I haven't actually read them because I'm not a superhero guy. So
right. Well, ISOM isn't a superhero. That's what's so interesting about him. In fact, there's a good question there whether there are any superheroes in the Eric July vision. But he calls them accepts, which is short for exceptionals. And they're people with unexplained abilities. But are they superheroes? We have not yet seen anyone act like a superhero, except possibly Alpha Core in the Chuck Dixon wrote and was illustrated by Joe Bennett. But Gooding is a good guy. When you read that book, you're going to be enthralled. It's going to grab you by the throat on the first page. It's going to hold you all the way to the last page. And then I have another book I created for him that I can't talk about now, which may be the best script I've ever written.
I love that. Don't you just dig when you write something and your fingers can't keep up with your brain, right?
That happens intermittently, and when it doesn't happen, I just stop.
Oh,
right.
And
stare.
My favorite Walter Gibson story, because Walter Gibson, creator of The Shadow, pulp writer par excellence, 300 plus Shadow pulps. He wrote almost every single one, and he'd write 2 a month. He would write so furiously that after he got his stuff done, he'd have to take 2 days to rest his fingertips.
Well, that reminds me of Blaine Pardo. Because Blaine writes so fast. I can't believe it. He's forcing me to write faster than I ever have in my life.
Oh, yeah.
I do want to mention one more project we have in the works, and that's Sherlock Holmes versus Captain Nemo. And it's illustrated by Richard Bonk, and it is as if Richard Bonk has been waiting his whole life to do steampunk. The art is going to blow your mind, and it's done. It's ready to go. But it's going to be a number of months before we get to it because we want to get through these Nexus things first. But we may be launching Sherlock Holmes versus Captain Nemo by the end of the year.
Very, very cool. All right, man. I can't thank you for joining me enough. You are welcome back anytime.
Thank you, sir.
I had too much fun in this conversation. I had to steer us back on topic many, many times, and that's always a good sign. Incidentally, I do have a few, here we go, previews here of Ghost of the Badlands, which is now out. And I forgot to even get to those because we were so wrapped up in our conversation. But it's a fun comic if you like the Western, if you like Divine Retribution Westerns of the Clint Eastwood 70s variety. I think you'll all enjoy that, folks. But Mike Barron, sir, I can't thank you enough for being
Well,
here.
thank you, Razor, for having me on.
Yeah,
we'll trade books.
Yes, I'm proud to have you in the Iron Age, as it were, as a part of this giant expulsion of creativity, and you are definitely one of the gems in that crown for sure. Folks, until next time, for Mr. Barron, I am RazörFist. Godspeed,